Good morning. My name is Tim Rusbridge and I'm the Event Director for Waste Expo Australia. On behalf of Reed Exhibitions and my team and I would like to welcome you to the opening day of our 6-week virtual conference. I begin by acknowledging that I'm the land of the Gadigal and the Birrabirragal people, the traditional custodians of the land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It has been a challenging year for everyone, and I'm sure we find ourselves, like many others, having to adapt to ensure we continue to operate as business as usual. To us, this meant cancelling our physical event and pivoting to a digital offering. We've been delighted with the response from the industry and are grateful to all the speakers and sponsors that have offered their support in launching our first digital event. That said, I look forward to seeing you all again next year in Melbourne at Waste Expo Australia. Just to let you know that all presentations will be available on our website at the end of the week, so please do visit www.wasteexpoaustralia.com. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our chair, Pete Schmigel, CEO of the Australian Council of Recycling. Pete has over 25 years of experience in the environmental sustainability, politics, business, consulting and mental health. Prior to becoming CEO of the Australian Council of Recycling, he served as the CEO of Lifeline Australia, the BioRecycle Business Alliance and the Beverage Industry Environment Council, and in senior roles with Telstra and Nolan ITU. He's also been a senior advisor to several premiers and ministers and serves as 3 NGO boards in the health and wellbeing space. So Pete, thank you ever so much, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone. And I would like to, in the first instance, join the acknowledgement of country. I'm on the land of the Birrabirragal clan of the Darug people here in Western Sydney. And that's perhaps fitting because Birrabirragal, one of the meanings of that word, that clan name is meeting place. And that's exactly what we're doing here today across this new technology. Well, the session has a very non-specific and deterministic name, policy. So you could fit a million things under that. But I suggest that what we're really trying to today is to give participants an update effectively on what's happening around the country in terms of waste minimization, resource recovery and recycling policy and associated programs. And more particularly, some insights from 3 of the leading doers in the sector at the moment, 2 from Victoria and Mike, who works across the country, but our Victorian colleagues no doubt also have national insights from their interactions with other colleagues. Yeah, the thematic question that I have in my mind and that we'll try to tease out from speakers as we go along is we're doing heaps, lots of activity all over the place in terms of policy reform. Is it likely to achieve different things than what we've achieved in the past? Is it likely to achieve different things than what we've achieved in the past? So quickly as we go around the grounds, we of course have the Commonwealth entering into the waste minimization policy field as never before. Legislation going to Parliament in the next week or so. $250 million acknowledged in the budget last time, the first time that recycling's ever been acknowledged in a Commonwealth budget. Money flowing through to infrastructure. And of course, the ban on some materials to be exported from some municipal solid waste and other markets. So lots of activity at the Commonwealth level. New South Wales in the middle of writing a draft 20-year strategy with ambitious targets. Queensland enacting a freshly minted strategy including some interesting innovation around their waste levy, for instance, where they've on an unprecedented basis said 70% of that collected should go back into waste reduction efforts. South Australia, draft strategy as well, and some very interesting and leading work around reducing the plastic footprint. I'm told, for instance, that the discussion paper on plastic minimization in South Australia attracted more public interest than any on any policy topic ever put out by the South Australian government. So that says something about community engagement. Western Australia, draft strategy, and as of this week, introducing its brand spanking new container deposit scheme. Tasmania, draft strategy. And finally, Victoria, I'll leave that to our panelists to talk about more, but a heap of activity, be it program-wise, organizational structures, regulatory responsibilities, a whole suite of reforms standardization of curbside, you name it. And I guess all of this we should bear in mind comes under the guise of one thing, and that's the National Waste Policy recently enacted, and its very ambitious target of 80% waste diversion. So, lots and lots going on, but do all of those inputs lead to outputs? Does it take us any closer to waste diversion goals? Does it take us any closer to the promises of sustainability? Does it enact this magical thing called the circular economy? We know that we're paddling, but is all that paddling appropriate to where we want to go? And is it appropriate to the currents in which we're paddling? So, the format for today will be following that introduction I just gave you. We're going to hear from Dr. Kathy Wilkinson, the CEO of the Environment Protection Authority, Claire Ferris, the CEO of Sustainability Victoria, Mike Ritchie, the Managing Director of MRA Consulting Group, and I'm going to introduce all of them in a second. But can I do a virtual show of hands first? You can basically put a plus in the Q&A thing or something like that as a way of testing out the Q&A thing. And that is, how many of you right now at home are wearing no pants? So if you're not wearing pants, please put a plus or a tick in the Q&A box, and that way we know whether the Q&A box is working. I do that facetiously, but also to encourage you to use the Q&A box as we go through. If you put up questions there towards the end of the session, I'll try to grab at least some of those questions and put them back to our speakers if I have the time allowing. I can see that we're up to about 30 pantsless people. Outstanding, congratulations. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll hear first from Claire, and then from Kathy, and then from Mike, and I'll introduce all of them in terms of bios right now. Claire, our first speaker, was appointed to CEO of Sustainability Victoria, November 19, and previously she has a strong background in local government, including as City of Melbourne's Director of City Strategy and Place. She's also comes from a transport background, including roles for Transport for London, as well as here in Victoria and for local government. She's been recognized with an IPAA, which is the Institute of Public Administration of Australia Victorian Fellow of 2019, and a top 50 women in the Victorian Public Sector Award in 2017. So Claire has a great qualification to address us today, and an interdisciplinary background, which is also very important. She'll be followed by Dr. Kathy Wilkinson. Kathy became CEO of the EPA in 2018. She's a senior executive with significant public sector experience, leading the development and implementation of major policy and regulatory reforms in the Vic government, including across a variety of portfolios: planning, water, environment. Kathy also brings some specific insights because she spent a lot of time working on policy issues overseas, including in Sweden. She consulted to governments across Europe and achieved a PhD at the Stockholm Resilience Center. So again, what you might call some non-wasty perspectives on the resource recovery space. And that takes us to the ultimate wasty, or the ultimate recycling guy, in order to be politically appropriate, who is Mike Ritchie, a good friend who's got 25 years experience in the environmental and waste sector. Mike has labored successfully at places like Visy, Suez, WSN, Brisbane City Council, and now leads MRA, which is one of the country's leading, if not the leading, consultancy when it comes to waste and resource recycling issues. And Mike always has original and incisive things to say that challenge us all, including me. So, without further ado, that was a long, big spiel. I look forward to hearing from our speakers. And the first one of them is Claire Ferris, CEO of Sustainability Victoria.
Hi, Pete. Thank you so much for the introduction, and hello to everyone that's on the call today. I'm sitting in the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in the outer east of Melbourne in the Dandenong Ranges. And thank you for calling me a wastie. When I worked in transport, the phrase was a gunzel. You know, people that were obsessed with transport are all gunzels. And I'm very happy to be a wastie and speaking to you today. It's great to transition, and congratulations to Waste Expo Australia, and thank you for the invitation to transition to a virtual conference, but equally I look forward to hopefully seeing many of you in 3 dimensions in 2021 when we are able to do so. So I thought I'd just kick off just by saying a little bit about Sustainability Victoria, or SV, what we're doing in terms of Recycling Victoria, and particularly about a number of the programs that we're currently got on our plate. The first thing just to kick off is SV is a delivery agency of the Victorian Government. Our purpose is to support all Victorians to transition to a circular and climate resilient economy. And in terms of the topic of this panel discussion today, in shorthand, our job for me and my team to be successful is to translate policy into action. So we work with businesses, industry, research partners, academia, local government, schools and community groups to deliver collective action. In Victoria, we have the Climate Change Act, and more recently in February, Minister D'Ambrosio announced the Recycling Victoria policy, and SV has a significant role to play in terms of meeting those government targets across our 2 big strategic challenges. Firstly, to transition to a new economy, a circular economy, and very interested in having a debate today about, you know, is that real or is that another catchphrase? I think it's real. To increase waste recovery to 80% by 2030. And also we have the goal to achieve zero net emissions by 2050. Our programs at SV are very much defined by 3 things. We love data, and so everything that we do, we are looking for insights from our engagement with all of our key stakeholders, including industry, about checking in the whole time with strategic foresight about what are we doing today? Are we aware, and do we have the context about what could be happening next month, next year, and the years to come, so that we can pivot and change if we need to? The second thing, and as COVID-19 has obviously shown us this year, is we need to make sure that our programs are responsive to changing environments, that they can scale and be adaptable depending on the circumstance of what's happening out in the sector. And thirdly, that our programs have to have a cradle-to-cradle mindset, that there have to be a system-wide change that's looking for impact at scale. But by 2025, if SV is successful, we would have invested $400 million in the recycling sector, 3 million tonnes of emissions would have been abated, and 1,000 new jobs would have been created. So just a little bit about Recycling Victoria. It's a $300 million policy on behalf of the Victorian Government. It's a bold 10-year strategy to transform the waste and resource recovery sector in Victoria. And I like to describe it as a decade of action. It is a commitment, it's the largest commitment the Victorian Government's ever made to really look at this system-wide change across the whole value chain, all the way from collection, processing, end markets and new economies that can come out of the full system change. And there's a role to play for all of us on this call in terms of how we be successful. I wanted to just outline 3 programs that I thought would be interesting to the participants at the conference. The first one is the Recycling Victoria Infrastructure Fund, which was launched in February. So round 1 kicked off with just under $40 million. And this is very much about a partnership between government and industry to increase processing and recycling capacity in the state. And we're really looking to see Victoria as the home for recycling investment at scale for southeastern Australia. So there's 2 streams that we're looking at. The first is around hazardous waste. There's $11.5 million for that, which is about improving the recycling of solvents from liquid hazardous waste. And the second one is a whole suite of material streams that focus on paper, cardboard, plastics and glass. The second program that I just wanted to mention, and I'm interested in the discussion today, is SV provides a unique service to the Victorian community with expertise in behavioural insights. And so we use a comprehensive science-based approach to understand the social, structural and cultural drivers that underpin our society, to better understand how we can support the community to act differently in the way that they work and live. And many of you that are in Victoria may have seen a recent statewide campaign called Know Your Recycling, which was a way, and we all understand it, we have 79 councils at the moment that have different rules and different ways, different bin lid covers in terms of how they collect their waste. This is the first of a 4-year program of campaigns and information of education and behaviour change for people to better understand what does and what does not go in the recycling bin, and also moving towards lower waste living and options in terms of reducing waste production. It was a good example. It was a campaign for 5 weeks. Over half of the Victorian population recalled seeing it, and it achieved real impact. We saw a 2% reduction in recycling contamination for soft plastics and plastic bags in the recycling bin. So it definitely works, but it's about having the right information provided to the community that is easy to understand and easy to act upon. And the third thing that I wanted to raise just in my introductory comments, and incredibly important in terms of this conference, is SV is absolutely, our role is to be a partner with industry. And so we very much want to collaborate with you to translate new ideas into investments. And so there's a suite of programs under Recycling Victoria in terms of how do we increase demand for recycled products, investigating new business models, and investing in industry development to accelerate markets and new jobs. And so some of the examples that we have are a Recycled First policy, a Buy Recycled directory, which is I like to describe it as a speed dating channel between suppliers and buyers in terms of how do we connect people that have an interest in procurement in terms of increasing recycled content in their investment decisions. The Sustainable Infrastructure Fund, which is very much about supporting councils to increase their recycled content. In this month, we're going to be launching the Circular Economy Business Innovation Centre, which is very much around translating ideas into investment and to new products and business models. And finally, there is a significant markets acceleration package that we're leading, a $30.5 million fund to support manufacturers to create new products. So I'm happy to expand on many of these initiatives during the panel discussion, but really I just wanted to close by encouraging to look to SV for opportunities, to engage, to partner, to apply, to ask great questions of us. We are a learning organisation, so we really welcome feedback about the programs and initiatives that we're putting out. Is it fit for purpose? If it's not, we want to know. We very much want to design our programs to increase value and impact. We are stewards of public money. If we're not doing the right things, come and tell us and we'll adapt and change. And really confident that together we can deliver this decade of action. And I just think it's incredibly exciting about the opportunity that's before us. Thanks, Pete.
Well, thank you, Claire. I heard strong content in Claire's presentation around 3 prongs, if you will, of activity: infrastructure investment, changing consumer and community behaviors and corporate behaviors around waste and recycling, and a lot of emphasis also on market development, and all within kind of a general theme or characteristic of collaboration and partnership with people like the ones on this call. So we thank Claire for that, and we're going to come back to those perhaps 3 areas and which ones we think are going to give us the biggest bang for the buck. Next, I'd like to ask our next participant to speak, and that's Dr. Kathy Wilkinson from EPA Victoria.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and join this virtual conference. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm coming to you from, which is the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation here in Victoria, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. Look, in my introductory comments ahead of the panel discussion, I was wanting to give a bit of an overview of the transformation that EPA Victoria is on, an overview of the legislation that is intended to come into effect 1st of July next year, and also connect in how EPA is playing a part in the Recycling Victoria policy. So if we just go on to the next slide, in Victoria, EPA is the regulator of pollution and waste. So our purpose is to prevent harm from pollution and waste. We have the biggest transformation in our history underway over the past 2 to 3 years, and it's really towards becoming a preventative regulator that can focus on preventative actions, establish a strong regulator that can ensure a level playing field, which is just so critical to underpin the waste sector in general, and so many of the Recycling Victoria initiatives that are underway. So if we go to the next slide, just touching on how EPA fits into Victoria's circular economy policy that Claire touched on, it's not possible to create a mature waste sector, achieve all the sustainability, circular economy goals that the government wants to, that we need to as a society, unless you're ensuring a level playing field across the waste sector by having a strong regulator. That's why we have a zero tolerance approach to waste crime, to ensure the community is protected, the environment's protected from illegal and unsafe storage of waste, but also to ensure there's that level playing field for the sector. I am sure that everyone on this conference, this virtual conference, are the committed, mature players in the waste sector. What we as the regulator need to make sure of is that there is a strong level playing field so that you can all get on, do your work, provide that essential service for communities, and that's what we're focused on at EPA Victoria. There's been significant investment through Recycling Victoria in setting up a new waste crime prevention inspectorate at EPA that will have 70 officers in it, and ensure that we're working collaboratively with other co-regulators, law enforcement, emergency management agencies, and so on, so that we can ensure waste crime is dealt with in Victoria. We also have a critical role to play working with DELP as the policy arm here in Victoria to ensure unnecessary regulatory barriers around the reuse of recycled materials are removed. If we move on to the next slide, in terms of preventing and disrupting waste crime, we now have significant surveillance powers under the new legislation. We have new drone technologies. We've basically got more boots on the ground, drones in the sky, and intelligence connectivity across the different regulators to ensure we're disrupting any waste crime that happens. That includes additional resources, looking at waste levy, mismanagement, and so on, in relation to collection of the levy. If we move on to the next slide, I wanted to move on to the environment protection laws. So these laws have been passed by Parliament. EPA Victoria has been around for 50 years next year, and we were one of the very first EPAs around the world to get in, to be established, essentially. What the new Environment Protection Amendment Act 2018 does is really says, what are the sort of laws we need in Victoria to handle the coming 50 years of environmental protection in the state? And it's a comprehensive overhaul. It's focused on prevention. It's focused on reducing regulatory burden, and significantly it introduces a criminally enforceable general environmental duty. The duty, as stated in the legislation, is that a person who is engaging in an activity that may give rise to risks of harm to human health and the environment from pollution or waste must minimise those risks so far as reasonably practical. In Victoria, it's based on the OH&S legislation, which is also a duties-based legislative framework with a general duty as well. So that what that means is for industries already operating with OH&S laws, there's a lot of similarities in the way the new laws have been crafted, and that's been deliberate so that there's streamlining, I guess, of the approach. In terms of the specifics of what's changing, if we go to the next slide, the new legislation, as I've mentioned, is prevention-based. Compared to the previous act where the focus was on, we had a whole heap of powers and tools, regulatory tools, if pollution had occurred. The new Act is very much focused on prevention and focuses our new tools and our new regulatory powers and indeed the duties on everyone under the general environmental duty on implementing systems to reduce risk from and harm from happening in the first place. And that's where our effort will be focused. Some of the specific powers in the new legislation relating to the waste sector include strong regulatory duties across the whole waste chain from generators to transporters. I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. There's a significant increase in maximum fines and penalties for breaching the environmental duty. So it'll be up to 1.6 million for a corporation. It introduces a concept of repeat waste offenders, which will enable a court to consider a prison term of up to 2 years for a person who's previously committed an offence in relation to industrial waste or waste dumping offences. Stronger fit and proper person tests relating to an individual's previous history, and that can affect obtaining licences and so on. And as I mentioned, introduces new modern surveillance methods. So a whole heap of tools and powers for the EPA to send very strong messages out there that everybody needs to be doing everything they can that's reasonably practicable to prevent harm from occurring in the first place, with significant consequences if that's not in place. Now, EPA is supporting that new approach with significant additional guidance and duty holder support. So over the past 2 years, one of the very first things we did, and this was 2 or 3 years ago now, was set up an industry guidance unit. And that's the unit that has now developed preventative guidance for different sectors, including the waste sector. And I'll touch a little bit more on that in a moment as well. On the next slide, we've just got an overview of the new waste framework. So the permissioning framework under the new legislation in Victoria is different. It introduces a tiered permissioning system, licenses for the highest risk sites, permits for the medium, registrations for the lower risk. And then there's another tool called a declaration of use or determination. So, you know, your big scale waste resource recovery facilities are obviously in the licensed one. In the lower tier, the registrations, some of the new ones there are things like dry cleaning that uses solvents and so on. Reportable priority waste transport is an example of that would fit in the registration category. So a real streamlining there, so that all permissions, we had so many before scattered across so many different tools, all permissions focused on that new framework. The next slide shows the waste duties framework. So whether you are a generator of waste, a transporter of waste, or a receiver of waste, there are now positive proactive duties on you to ensure that the material is classified appropriately and only transported to destinations that are permitted to receive it. Again, with significant penalties if that's not followed. We have developed, as some of you would very well be aware in Victoria, a new digital waste tracker system, which will come online to support the new system. It's designed for the new system. It will be mobile enabled. We've already been testing that waste tracker system with some of you, make sure we've got that user feedback and so on. But it will provide a very straightforward way for all generators, transporters, receivers of waste to be able to comply with the new framework. And as between now and when the new legislation comes into effect, which is intended for 1st of July next year, we'll be doing a whole heap of further engagement with the waste sector in Victoria, working very closely with waste associations and so on. The next slide talks to reducing the regulatory barriers, and this really goes back to that broader Recycling Victoria policy, which is about encouraging, recycling, reuse of materials and so on. Some of you, if you're on the call from Victoria, may be familiar with the subordinate legislation that was put out for public comment. We received a lot of feedback from you saying actually more guidance was needed around some of those materials that are prime for recycling or high volume, to take some of the uncertainty out of it. We've heard that feedback, and as a result we're working on several determinations that will allow certain waste types to be lawfully received and exit the waste framework. So those are listed there in the green box: organic waste, manures, aggregates, fill material and waste tyres. So we heard your feedback. We're working on determinations which will set the standards for those, and they're expected to be in place before the new legislation comes into effect, with time to engage with you on them as well. In terms of support for stakeholders, if we go on to the next slide, there's a whole heap of guidance and further information that is already on our website. So if you go to epa.vic.gov.au/new laws, you can get access to that information now. And we're adding to that all the time. We have industry reference groups at EPA to support engagement ahead of the new legislation. We've got one focused on the waste sector, but if there's anything that you would like more information about, please do contact us, and we'll put up the details in a moment, so that you can get that information. We can add it to the list to be prioritised and so on. In terms of the next slide, I know many of you have, well, from Victoria at least, have very much engaged in the subordinate legislation, and we did receive many, many submissions. Thank you so much for your engagement on that. You can still, if you're interested in looking at that detail, you can still access that on the Engage Vic website, and we've put the address up there. We've received a lot of feedback. We'll certainly be sharing the response to that feedback once the regulations are made public and so on. We've heard you that you'd like that available as soon as possible, and we're certainly working to be able to respond to that. But there's lots of information on that website, including things like an overview of the proposed instruments, the guide to the Environment Protection Regulations, the guide to the proposed environmental reference standards. There's also a specific document that summarises the proposed noise framework, the proposed waste framework, and so on. So I encourage you to look at that, but obviously keep engaging with us as well. If we go to the next slide, obviously that's a very quick overview as part of the introductory comments ahead of the panel discussion. If you have any questions of us, either that we're not going to get to in the panel discussion or otherwise, here are some of the many ways you can find out more from us, get in touch. We very much would welcome hearing from you. So I might leave it there, but looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilkinson, for the detailed, at least on some level, explanation of the new regulatory framework that fits within the Recycling Victoria approach. I think it's fair to say that the Recycling Victoria approach is about both carrots and sticks, and I don't have any fear of sticks. Sticks are a good thing. They're about certainty and stability, and I think most people in industry value those things in terms of their investment decisions, and certainly the new framework is providing much greater clarity about the role of the EPA, the rules by which we all have to play in order to maintain social license for waste minimization and resource recovery operators. Kathy mentioned questions. We are getting them coming through the Q&A feature. If they are specific questions, what we'll be doing is we'll be effectively downloading those subsequent to session and distributing them to panelists and having them and their organizations come back to you on a one-on-one basis. I'll probably pull out some of the ones that are more generalistic, if you know what I mean. Okay. I have been asked also on the chat mechanism why I'm wearing high vis today. And the reason is because of our next speaker. Mike Ritchie is a dangerous human being. He has many dangerous ideas. I'm being completely facetious. Mike speaks his mind. He has many years of basis on which to speak his mind. He challenges some of our assumptions. He tells home truths about the waste minimization policy area. I hand over to Mike for his comments.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to the previous speakers, Claire and Kathy, brilliant talks. I am going to do a very quick overview of the state of waste policy in Australia. Thanks, next slide. And some home truths, as Peter said. Let's start with some principles. And in 5 minutes, I'm going to race through a few points and facts. First of all, waste is discarded. By definition, it's unwanted, surplus, or abandoned. So consequently, the cheapest price or the cheapest cost of disposal is always the best disposal option for all things waste. So waste is like a river. Think like that. It flows downhill to the cheapest price, and while ever we have very cheap landfills in the Australian economy, that's where the waste is flowing. And landfill levies increase the headroom for recyclers to actually enter the market and compete with cheap landfills and create valuable product and services. And while ever we have cheap landfills, they are the competition to recycling. And that seems bleedingly obvious, but most people in waste policy and many in government still don't understand that landfill competes with recycling for a limited range of materials, and those materials are the recyclates that we want to recover. Consequently, most recycling is uneconomic compared to cheap landfill. And that collecting it and sorting it is worth more than the product is worth. The cost of collecting and sorting it is worth more than the inherent value of the commodity. Fourth point, organics is the biggest stream, but it is expensive compared to underpriced landfills to recover. And we will not and cannot hit the government targets that both Kathy and Claire have mentioned without changes and significant changes to the price and or regulatory signals in the Australian economy. Thanks very much. And we've done very well, but we haven't done enough. And this is kind of case in point. Waste generation has grown in the last 20 years about 140%, 4 times the rate of population growth. We buy more, consume more, and what it absolutely tracks is the state of the economy. So as we grow our economy, albeit we're in a minor recession at the moment, waste generation increases, and we've had almost no effect of uncoupling waste generation from growth in the economy. Next slide. But what we have done is grown our recycling rate from 7% in 1996 to 56% in 2019. As I said, waste is like a river. It flows downhill, and while ever we had cheap landfills, we were landfilling 21 million tonnes in 1996. We happen to be landfilling 21 million tonnes still, so in other words, landfill volume hasn't changed at all, but we're recycling an awful lot more because many states have started pricing the landfills and introducing landfill taxes as both a revenue stream and a source of funding for investing in recycling and resource recovery. What's changed, of course, is the new national state target that Peter mentioned of 80% diversion by 2030, which requires us to recycle at least another 12 million tonnes per year on top of the 30 odd million tonnes that we're doing now every year, plus any growth in generation that happens in the next 9 years. That is a massive undertaking, and we are not going to achieve it unless we fundamentally change some more economics and or the regulatory settings that make recycling the default position as opposed to landfill being the default position. And landfill is still the default outcome for most waste streams in Australia. Thanks. This slide just puts it another way. The blue line is the growth rate in waste generation, the green line is the growth rate in recycling, and the red line is waste to landfill. And you can see it, waste to landfill hasn't changed at all in 20 years. And yet we now have a new target of 80% diversion. So we have to massively grow that green line and significantly reduce the red line by another 12 million tonnes downwards per year. Thanks, next slide. So what are we doing well? Well, as I said, we've got a reasonably good recycling rate compared to global competitors. Our waste collection system is very efficient. The waste industry is very market driven. It's a very efficient sector. You send it the right price signals and it'll move very quickly. The Queensland government reduced their landfill levy by $35 and suddenly we were transporting 1 million tonnes of waste from Sydney to Brisbane to take advantage of that arbitrage and opportunity. It's a very responsive sector to price and regulatory signals. That's a good thing, but if you've got the pricing and regulatory signals wrong, well, you'll get a bad outcome. We have reframed the debate in the last decade towards diversion from landfill, resource recovery, circular economy. That's all good. But my fundamental position is the rate of change is far too slow. I didn't set the national targets. They've been endorsed now by the Commonwealth, all the states and territories and local government. I didn't set them. But given that we have an 80% target, the right question of government is, well, are we on track to achieve them? And if the answer to that is no, then the question is to government, what are you going to do about it? Because you have the levers of authority, I don't. Next slide, please. This is what we have at the moment. The current state targets are all over the place and the performance to those targets, which is the solid bars, are equally all over the place. And yet we now have for the first time an agreed national target of 80% diversion by 2030. So all of those current targets need to be wiped away and replaced with the 80% target and a plan to how we're going to get there in the next 9 years. Next slide. On the upside, the states have finally recognised that economics drives the waste industry and recycling, and they've introduced landfill taxes. They're not where they need to be yet. I advocate for a national $200 a tonne landfill tax. That would raise about $4 billion a year and would offset payroll tax, for example. Why do we pay a bad tax, an inefficient tax in the form of payroll tax, when we could be paying an efficient tax in the form of an environmental tax which delivers positive environmental outcomes? It just doesn't make sense to me. We'd be paying the same tax dollar but getting beneficial outcomes from a landfill tax rather than disingenuous taxing of payrolls and employment. So states are moving in the direction, but we're nowhere where we need to be yet. And you'll see the green line there. Queensland went from $35 to $0. We transported 1 million tonnes to Queensland, as I mentioned, and now it's gone up to $75. And Victoria and South Australia are tracking upwards towards the New South Wales 146. My argument, as I said, is that we should continue to grow those over the next decade to drive industry investment and create that headroom for recycling. Next slide. And this is the effect of the landfill pricing across the country. You can see a massive differential in what it costs to landfill, and the cheaper the landfill, the less recycling happens. Simple as that. Next slide. And I think this slide shows it the best. This is some recent work done by the MRA team, looking at the relationship between metro landfill levies and the rate of recycling across the country. And you can see the trend line is pretty unequivocal, and it explains 75% of the variation in resource recovery rates across the country. That is the power of landfill pricing on resource recovery. It explains 75% of the tonnage movement that we see across the country is explained by the price of landfill. All the other minor streams and all the other minor initiatives are great and worth having, but if you want to move major tonnes out of landfill, you've got to create the economic environment for people to invest in infrastructure, build bits of kit and process that mixed waste, which has no other home other than landfill or resource recovery. And ultimately, if you can't recover it for resources, we should be recovering it for energy and building energy from waste system to deal with that high calorific residual waste stream. Next slide. There are very little consistency around the regulatory settings across the country. The ban we actually need across the country is a ban on unprocessed organics to landfill. That's what Europe did 2 decades ago. All organics is now processed to turn it into compost or fuel. In Australia, that would be largely be processed back into organics, into compost, and that represents 10 million tonnes or 50% of the waste we currently send to landfill. Next slide. And my last slide is the issue here is urgent. The waste industry currently abates about 50 million tonnes of Australia's emissions, about 10%. We emit about 11 million tonnes directly of our own direct emissions, but we have the potential to abate at least another 50 million tonnes through 4 simple actions. And the accounting for this doesn't show up in the waste industry's numbers. It shows up in the metal smelter, it shows up in the aluminium smelter, it shows up in the paper mills that are not part of the accounting for the waste sector. And there's at least another 50 to 60 million tonnes achieved by better recycling and putting those materials back into the productive economy, diverting the organics from landfill, capturing the methane that's already being emitted from our landfill stock, 11 million tonnes, and finally, capturing the embodied energy value of residual streams that can't be recycled, such as dirty plastic or dirty textiles. Thanks very much. And that's my last slide, Pete.
So thank you very much, Mike, for a presentation that, like always, challenges us in terms of, what are our current settings? Are they sufficient? What should they be? And very importantly, introduces the aspect of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, which is one that we should never be blind to as those involved in waste and resource recovery activities. I have slightly different numbers than Mike, but I recently ran it across as well of the 25 or so existing jurisdictional targets with regard to waste reduction. On my numbers, I believe about 2 targets have been met out of those 25. And sure enough, coinciding with Mike's stream of thought, the heavier the material, the more homogeneous the material, like construction and demolition materials, the more it responds to landfill levies and the more of it is diverted, as opposed to, let's say, something like plastics. Okay, panelists, are you ready? So, well, why don't we start there? We've heard that some of the defining features of the current policy set and program set is putting money into gear, building infrastructure for recycling, building new markets through a variety of initiatives and programs, a better regulatory framework, more certainty for the variety of players, behavioral change, people knowing what to do and how to do it, what bins to put in, et cetera, et cetera. Panelists, does that combination of things get us to 80% waste diversion, or is Mike Ritchie right that we have to do more?
I'll start, Pete. We can always do more. I think it's, well, in Victoria, Recycling Victoria was only announced, the policy was announced in February, and we're moving at pace in terms of delivering on that agenda. I think that one of the questions that's come through, I saw on the feed, was very much around, we can't get access, or we've tried to access funds, or we've got a good idea, but, the way the Victorian system's set up, we can't, it doesn't work. I guess my answer to those sorts of questions is come and talk to us about what's not working and what's your idea. And, the guidelines we have in place, we're trying to be as nimble as possible in terms of the opportunities to, like I said, to translate ideas into investment and into action. And I think the opportunity is to demonstrate the value from the policy that we've already got in place, and to demonstrate what we're achieving. And then, success breeds success in terms of more opportunities of how we could continue to do more on top of the policy commitment we've already got.
Okay, so I'm hearing that we've now got a turbocharged model and that we want to do more in terms of reaching out to the industry, partnering with them. And that is something that will give us a degree of success. Kathy, from your perspective?
Yeah, look, I think, like Claire, we can always do more, but well, and I can really only speak to Victoria, I guess, but the ambition is bold. So I think we're looking at step change here in many respects, certainly in terms of the role of the regulator to support. And it's not just on the tougher end of regulation, it's the enabling legislation, regulation, flexibility of standards to, I guess, support the sector as a whole and the achievement of the goals. So we can always do more. I think what's critical is that whichever jurisdiction we're dealing with, and certainly in terms of the relationship between the Commonwealth and the state, that we're looking at as a system and not going after addressing only one part of it. Because I think what we've all learned over the past numbers of years is unless you deal with the entire system, from infrastructure investments to market generation to pull through to strong regulator, unless you get that whole system working, you know, the levies, as you mentioned, Mike, you're not going to get that step change that we all have in common as a shared goal.
Okay, so Mike, if you're hearing it the same way I'm hearing it, Claire and Kathy are in part arguing that what's new and different is we've got this system-wide approach now, making all of these pieces of the puzzle fit together in order to affect greater change, perhaps than we've seen in the past. Do you buy it?
Part of the problem of being in this industry for 30 years is you get to that age where you go, oh gee, I've seen this before. And I remember the hub and spokes plan coming out of Victoria that said this will be the greatest thing since sliced bread, and they removed all the targets, and consequently Victoria plateaued for 5 or 6 years. I am very enthused and encouraged by Victoria. I have to say I think it's one of the best plans that we have going in the country. They have an infrastructure gap analysis. They have an infrastructure needs assessment. They have a infrastructure investment and procurement prospectus. They have a plan that's been built at the local organic level and top down from the state level. They actually are the only state that is starting to put the pieces of the jigsaw together. I accept the fact that they say there's more we could do, but they at least know what they need to do. Most other states don't even know what they need to do to achieve it. They get sucked in by, we should recycle coffee cups, or we should ban single-use plastic bags, or, this stuff is great and nice to have if you're playing to a community audience. But we're not. We're talking about big licks of investment, billions of dollars of investment. So we need to approach it as an industry plan, procurement, policy, infrastructure investment, the pricing signals, the regulatory signals that Kathy has mentioned, mandatory procurement, a planning regime that actually facilitates infrastructure investment and doesn't leave superannuation funds and banks going, how do I invest in this sector? I want to, but I can't because I can't get an approval through in anything less than 5 years. They're the structural problems that only government can deal with. And they're not about plastic bags or straws or the kinds of things that get media attention. They are harder to achieve. I think Victoria is the best placed. I think New South Wales definitely has the best landfill pricing arrangements, and that creates the headroom. So they have set that trend, and I hope the other states will follow through. But I hope the other states also pick up from Victoria about integrating the infrastructure planning investment puzzle to get the stuff built in time. As for will we hit the 80% targets? No, I don't buy it, because there is no collective understanding at the meeting of environment ministers with Trevor Evans to say we are now embracing the 80% target and we're going to go and develop the appropriate plans to get there. And you have a kind of waterfall diagrams. What are we going to do by when to achieve X, Y, Z tonnes diversion? That work has not been done.
And with it, some national understanding and national debate about the appropriate economic signals that are necessary,
Correct.
whether the landfill levy or others.
Pete, can I just make a comment about, I love Mike's passion and I agree with a lot of you saying. I'm also happy to disagree with some of the things that you're saying, Mike. But I think the other thing we don't talk enough about is this is actually a cultural change across Australia in terms of, and I like to say, we've got to stop talking about waste and we've got to start talking about resources, because the concept that we produce, and I think that a slide, Mike, that you had around, that we're generating more, and yes, we're recycling more, so there's less, the same amounts going to landfill. But the fact we're generating more is a problem as well. I mean, the system, the study is a problem, and so it is a tougher conversation. It's in the Recycling Victoria policy about lower waste living, and it's been fascinating during COVID. We've actually generated more waste per head of population, more takeaway containers. The sharing economy is becoming more difficult. keep cups, all the things that we were sort of starting to make some progress on for public health reasons are now sort of perceived to be more difficult, and we need to find a way through that's safer. But there is a complete mind shift change that other countries in the world, I think, are probably more mature than we are in Australia, that actually everything we generate has value. And the important thing is actually to increase the products to their highest value. And I think some of the risks I'd say about our ambition is, putting glass into roads or plastic into roads is great, really exciting. It's better than it going into the ground, but actually it's not keeping those products at their highest value. So that's the first step, but we need to go further in terms of, well, what's another innovation to keep that value of that resource higher? So there is a risk here we race to the bottom, that we recycle things to the bottom, and we always have to test ourselves, is there another way in terms of, is there another opportunity to elevate the value of those resources? But it's a really big mind shift change across Australia, that everything that is produced, we need to think about what we do with it. And absolutely the last thing, the final, I think across the world, 8 or less than 10% goes into the ground or gets burnt or incinerated. But we're not there yet. And that's a 10-year conversation, I think, with the Australian community.
Claire, you underscore the term mindset change, the community shifting in its attitudes and its behaviors. You mentioned you've got a 4-year program rolling out in terms of those attitudes and those behaviors. Do you think that it is possible for the community to be educated to buy recycled content products if they struggle to put the right things in the right bins?
It's possible. I go from hope and despair. 1 week I read about, workers in Western Australia finding a goat in a recycling bin. One of my first briefs I got when I joined SV was to be told that one of the #1 contaminants in Victoria was nappies in recycling bins, which, just defies comprehension that anyone thinks that's an item that can be recycled in a recycling bin. So, but it is just an awareness of where the community is at. So I am hopeful. The example I gave in my opening comments, 5 weeks of statewide media and we get a 2% reduction in contamination. That clearly shows better, I think there's a hunger for information. We have a tool which is called recycling.vic.com.au, which basically you can type in any product and it gives you advice about what to do with it. So we've seen a lot of traffic to that in terms of people that are engaged. But I would say, and this is also learning across the climate portfolio of SV, is too often we focus our efforts on what we call the early adopters, which is normally about 16% of the community, or that are highly engaged. People call it the thin green wedge or whatever you want to call it, is the people that are interested, engaged and want to do things. We need to transition our narrative, our storytelling, the channels we use, the way we communicate to what we call the early and late majority, which is 60 to 70% of the community. The people that aren't necessarily driven by an environmental outcome, they might be driven by a purely economic, financial outcome, there might be a social outcome, but it's actually understanding what the barriers are to act, what's stopping them from doing the right behaviour. And the more you understand what the barriers are, then you can respond and remove those barriers. And I would say, even with the industry, the barrier is not always money. The barrier can be regulation, it can be planning, it can be a whole suite of things. And so I think it's actually having more conversations with the community and with industry about what is the thing that's stopping you from moving or changing your behaviour. And then I think that's when government becomes more effective too.
It's an interesting discussion about behavioral change. Kathy, I might actually involve you in it as well, and that is, your primary audience, your stakeholder group, and in fact, the waste industry people, recycling industry people. With the new framework, what sort of behaviors are you hoping to see from the waste and recycling sectors following, a period of some really awful and deservedly awful headlines, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. I mean, and before I go on to answer that, I just wanted to build on Claire's quickly, if I may, which is I think we've seen some great examples in society generally lately of really rapid behaviour change. So when the conditions are right, or the triggers are right, if you like, whether it's plastic bags or obviously in response to COVID, you can get really significant behaviour shifts very, very quickly, which demonstrates we can do this. Like if society as a whole, harnesses its energies around something, it's amazing what can be done quickly. Now, in terms of your more specific question about, our expectations of the waste sector, we expect duty holders and a much broader range of duty holders, not just the good ones, that always do the right things, but all the duty holders across the spectrum to be taking preventative action where it's reasonably practicable to do so. So what that means is that we want the sector to be connected to where is best practice and proactively putting that in place so that, as Claire said, rather than a race to the bottom, it's a race to the top. Now, that might sound very idealistic and so on, but that's practically what needs to happen. And as I've mentioned already, ensuring there's that level playing field from the regulator to ensure that it's not a race to the bottom in terms of environmental performance, in terms of human health risks, is just so critical. And I'll give you some examples. So we shifted a number of years ago to automatic unannounced inspections. And what would happen is we'd go out and a duty holder, and some of these are big names that may very well be in this virtual room. Hang on, you don't normally come out unannounced. Well, we do now. We've got a different regulatory posture. So being and now hang on, you don't normally stay and count the volume of stuff you've got. Well, you can't demonstrate to us from the environmental system you have in place that you're meeting license limits or whatever. So that's an example of we want the waste sector to be doing the right thing even when the regulator's not looking, and to be really looking to those preventative risk-based systems to put in place so that things are avoided, that risks don't materialise in the environment, that you're looking after your chemicals properly, you're not spilling into local waterways and really affecting communities, that you're looking to best practice emissions reduction and so on, are some of the things. Now, we're not waiting for the new legislation to already be having those conversations with duty holders. And it's great to see examples of duty holders, industries, companies that are coming to us saying, here's what we're thinking about a new risk management system, a new preventative system. We're learning from this best practice company internationally or whatever, or we believe we're best practice and we're sharing that through the industry association. They're the kind of behaviours, conversations we want to be having as the regulator.
Really interesting concept there about best practice and what that looks like. And I think we as resource recovery operators should fault ourselves a little bit that even in the way we resource our companies internally, we actually have to step up to that new mark. We're big bad companies in some respects, and we have to be as well resourced on regulatory issues as other members of the productive economy are relative to us. Good comment. I'm going to invite panelists to do something whilst I ask them another question, and that's to look through the Q&A. And if each panelist could pick a question from the Q&A that they can speak to, okay? That'll be the next round. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you a personal question. Not whether you're wearing pants or not. And that's the following. You're folks of great accomplishment, in different ways and in similar ways, yeah? You've seen a lot, as Mike said, 30 years, and Kathy and Claire, you've also seen a lot in various different roles, etc. When you look at the current situation with waste minimization and resource recovery policy and our targets and what we're striving for in Victoria and the country at the moment, what would you pull out of your personal experience as something that is really kind of informative or defining for you? What's your kind of like personal reference point that says, oh, I've seen this kind of thing before, I know it'll work, it won't work, etc. What's your kind of policy touchstone moving into the next, call it 5 years, personally?
I'm happy to go first, if that's helpful to others. So for me, it was such a defining experience living in Sweden for 7.5 years. I took a 2-year-old and a 2-month-year-old to the Arctic. We were literally just south of the Arctic Circle in far northern Sweden, which was a very small regional town. And we had the separated bins, and the culture was one of separation of waste, supported by societal structures across the jigsaw, Mike, that you were talking about, really, to support the broader policy objectives. So it was just fascinating living in a society for me where you saw that commitment and that all the different parts of the system working together, which is why earlier I guess identified that the whole of system approach is just so important. So that was a really significant personal experience, which is what you're asking for, because when you see something working and see something done, it just gives you that further confidence that it's possible. Now, you know, the whole, will all the different parts of the policy and so on ever come together in the ideal way when you're actually talking about a fundamental cultural or mindset shift? It takes time, it takes persistent commitment. So there's absolutely no holy grail, but it's pretty remarkable seeing something operating in practice.
Yeah, 100%. When you see it, you believe it. So for example, people ask, can we actually standardize the bin systems in Victoria and the rest of the country? Oh, that's too hard. There's too much variation. There's too many factors. Well, frankly, Canada's been doing it for 20 years. Mike, personal touchstone, reference point, you know what I'm driving at?
Yeah, well, I think for me, it's been the impact of working in the big corporate sector that want to invest and make money and build jobs and grow the economy, but a sustainable economy, one that actually, is circular in that really, it's a benign term, but it's a very powerful one, that we want to consume fewer resources and pump out less waste. And creating a circular economy is not easy. You're talking about circularising the economy, not just playing with recycling at the margins. And so when you get into the big corporate world and they're trying to make a return on investment at the same time as doing the right thing, then you very quickly focus on the 2 or 3 things that actually make a difference to that investment decision. And for me, it really clearly sent me in the direction of price, regulation, what actually makes the big difference to the big tons. While I'm fully supportive of things like behaviour change and getting people engaged in it, I was once asked by a council to set up a sustainable shopping program at a shopping centre. And I said, what on earth does that mean? When I push my trolley down the Woolies aisle, how do I sustainably shop? What do I buy that doesn't have the packaging, and what levers of control do I actually have as an individual? Wouldn't matter what. And I used this example. I said to this council officer, you're probably the most informed person in this community in terms of waste. Go and sustainably shop for me. And of course she came back and said, I can't. I don't have the influences that I need. No matter how well intentioned I am or how informed I am, then there are system problems here, which is why for me, I've met very much into the systems side of things. You've got to give people food and garden organics bin if you want them to recycle their organics. They're just not enough people will home compost. You've got to build the systems around people to give them the opportunity for then behaviour change to actually make any difference at all. Behaviour change works when you've got systems in place and you're looking for those incremental gains, as Claire mentioned, 2% gain here or there. But if we didn't have curbside recycling, all the education in the world would make no difference at all to how people recycle. You've got to have the systems, and we're nowhere near where we need to be. So that was my kind of learning. It's very much about the systems, price, regulation, getting the big blocks done, and then you can play at the margins.
And that very much echoes comments that perhaps the single biggest individual investor in the resource recovery industry at the moment, Raphael Geminder from Pact Group, he's publicly announced he's putting $500 million into the system. That's his message too. Scale, scale, scale if we actually want to achieve lofty targets, et cetera, et cetera. And that takes a lot of discipline. Claire?
I might go on a slightly different tangent. I'm somewhat unusual in terms of I'm a government executive, but I'm also a community activist. And so the most probably foundational thing that I've learned was back in 2004 when my local council decided to privatise the childcare centre that my kids went to and decided that it was not economic. And, you know, as any good community activist does, you know, the parents form a committee and you mount a campaign about that's not a great thing to do. But the thing that I learnt from that experience was about collective action. And over 5 years, effectively a small group of 5 parents working with our council, state government and federal government secured money and effectively rebuilt that whole centre. And it went from 30 places to 150 places with a community hall and kindergarten. And it sits there today. And I actually learnt from that experience the power of translating your passion, your ideas of the sort of society you want to work in into real outcomes. And it was probably, ironically, I then went on to work for local government and I spent 5 years fighting them, not my local council. But the thing that I learnt was that actually government can be incredibly effective if we work together. And I've taken that lesson throughout my whole career in government. It's about starting every conversation with a stakeholder, whether it's a community member or industry, with respect and honestly believing that they have wisdom and knowledge and expertise and insights to share. I do not know the answer to every question. And throughout my career, the outcome is always better when more people have been involved, more people have asked questions and more people have actually asked rigor about what we're doing. And so that's the thing in terms of how I lead SV every day. It's very much about getting more people involved, trying to work through what could be the best possible answer. And also, frankly, just owning it and being vulnerable and say, look, we tried this and it didn't work. And actually, we thought it was a good idea when we made the decision. We put a program to market. It didn't achieve what we wanted to. We've done a rigorous process about why not. We're not going to do it again, and let's try something else and see if that works.
Ooh-ah, you came to listen about recycling, and here we're having a nice chat about emotional integrity. Points to Claire. So 5 minutes left. We're going to have to go fast. Each one of my panelists pick a question and answer it in 30 seconds or less.
I'll go first because I've written my answer, if that helps. What's the difference between Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland was one of the questions. I thought, great question. I don't want to be, just the price person, but, levies, price signals, very different across those states. Queensland is now at $75, was at $0. Major problem with waste arbitrage. The regulatory settings are different in those states. As Kathy has said, the regulatory decision framework in Victoria is now strengthened, much better than it was. Queensland is nowhere near there yet. Their whole regulatory regime was dismantled. New South Wales is pretty good, probably a bit onerous, if anything, in New South Wales. The infrastructure planning framework in Victoria, the best in the country. Queensland, New South Wales, very laissez-faire, project developer driven and therefore unstructured. The market pull arrangements, the mandatory procurement, very weak in all states. So there is really no national or agreed process for mandatory procurement. There are some movements in that direction around, I think Kathy mentioned glass in roads and a few other things. Extended producer responsibility schemes, really a national responsibility, but very unequal, very little advocacy for it from the states. It's the fourth contingent, I think, around products. We need a recycling system, an energy from waste system, a landfill system, and an EPR system. And we really are not attacking the big streams well enough. Planning and approvals, Victoria, definitely the best as far as planning approvals and consents. New South Wales, disaggregated. And the one thing I would mention about Victoria, which I'd encourage all states to have a look at, is their research development and demonstration planning pathway, which means you can get a plant up and running and operating without having to go through your full EIS and your licensing requirements. And that is a major barrier to investment in infrastructure is that just the 4 or 5 year lag before you get an approval to get started. You've got all this investment sitting there doing nothing, burning cash. Really important for people to be able to get in and start operating and turn a cash flow and then go through the final approvals process. And Victoria had that. I mean, why the other states haven't adopted it, I don't know.
Very good comparative analysis from Mike Ritchie. And you know what? I reckon that as a free steaks and knives following this panel, if you eventually go to Mike Ritchie's website, you'll find a nice table that compares all the constituencies on the different policy categories, be it infrastructure development, strategic planning, levies, et cetera, because he's that kind of generous guy. Kathy and Claire, the question you picked.
Look, I'm happy to go next. So there was a question from Scott Bryant, which was around the role EPA plays in facilitating some of the circular economy outcomes and the observation that perhaps we're focused too much on the tough on crime policing kind of end of the regulatory spectrum. So, and I responded, Scott, to you in the comments, but perhaps for everyone's benefit, there's some people have the view that a regulator sits at one or other end of the spectrum. You're either carrots or you're sticks, and I don't believe in positioning of a regulator at either end. You have to operate across the spectrum of regulatory posture and tools, because you're dealing with a broad range of compliance attitudes from duty holders, and it's not appropriate for a one-size-fits-all approach. So as I mentioned, that's why we've deliberately initially set up the industry guidance unit. We set up the industry reference group, so we're connected in with the associations. It's why we meet very regularly with waste sector players to hear directly and provide active support. It's why we've listened to the sector in their feedback on the subordinate legislation, and we'll be making changes as a result of that. But I certainly don't shy away from the need for the regulator to set that level playing field by being boringly consistent so that community and environment can be protected, because we can't have a strong waste sector without that. So we will continue to work right across the spectrum, and that will be guided by the compliance attitude of our duty holders. And one of the things about the new legislative and regulatory framework is it provides so much more flexibility to support innovation and support the recycling sector. So things like the environmental reference standards, having codes of compliance and guidelines, and the way it's set up in the legislation, the regulation enables us to update it in a much simpler way, still evidence-based, of course, but in a much simpler way than some of these, other places, be it around the world or in Australia. It can take 10 years to update something that can make standards more flexible as technology changes, as we want to drive better resource recovery outcomes and so on. So we think there's a whole heap of opportunities, but we certainly won't ever be working at one end of the regulatory spectrum, if you like.
Well, thank you for sharing that that color and that context. I think that helps stakeholders really understand where you're coming from, Kathy. And I got to say that, having been around for far too long, a gentleman named Dr. Brian Robinson used to sit under the logo that you're in front of right now. And yeah. Brian, like yourself, also epitomized that wonderful balance of purpose and pragmatism. So I'm really grateful from an industry perspective about the point of view that you're bringing to all of this. Claire is going to do one final question. I know we've gone over time. But we'll wrap it up after Claire. And yes, I do promise that there is a recording of this available, and that the questions that have not been answered will be referred out. Claire.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, I'm going to answer a question from John McClellan. It's probably a controversial question, saying, Victoria collects, compulsory collects landfill levies that goes into the sustainability fund, and there's a perception the money never comes out. So there's, about $500 million in that fund. Recycling Victoria is $300 million that's coming out of that fund to deliver on the policy ambitions. It's the single biggest decision of the Victorian government in terms of using that money. So there is money going in and money coming out. So I just wanted to, and we, like I said before, success breeds success in terms of further opportunities, once we demonstrate outcomes of how we're delivering on the current $300 million policy commitment. The other thing I just wanted to briefly touch on, and Kathy and Mike both mentioned this about innovation, is we currently have requirements about, you know, grants and investment of Victorian government money, and we work closely with Invest Victoria. Really happy to hear feedback from industry, and I think there's been a few questions from today that they've tried and they haven't been able to get through because they don't tick every box. Is at the moment, you know, you need to have an ABN and you need to have either a partnership or a footprint in Victoria in terms of your business. But, you know, come to us and test that proposition with us. The outcome we are seeking is investment in Victoria. That's the outcome where we very much want to, and the question of scale, we very much want to see Victoria as the base for industry investment for Southeastern Australia, supporting our neighbours in South Australia and Tasmania that might not have enough tonnage in terms of actually making the commercial proposition. So we've got guidelines at the moment. We're happy to look at them again in terms of, is that creating a barrier rather than an incentive? And really, I just pick up on Mike's comment about this is very much also about working with the science community, with academics, with the university sector, about actually looking at new ways of doing things differently. And I close by saying I loved a phrase that someone in our transport area said recently, that when we look at recycled content in infrastructure, it's not a pilot, it's a validation exercise. And, you know, we tip our toe in the water. We need to be bolder to back ourselves and say, this is actually the future. And all we're doing is just checking that this is the new standard. We're not cautious about it.
What a great word to wrap on, boldness. So we can have that debate, and we have had that debate about whether the glass is half full or half empty in terms of the suite of policy and programs that is out there right now. But perhaps one of the ways that we go to that next level is in fact boldness in implementing what we currently have. So terrific word to end on. I want to thank our panelists. I think that everybody will agree, Mike, Kathy, and Claire have really been generous with their time and with their insights. As I say, I believe the recording will be available through the conference organizers. I've asked them a question about whether the slides will be or not. They'll come back to participants on that, and the questions will be referred out. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely day, and if you want to take your pants off now, you're entirely welcome to. Bye.